Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good evening, everybody. Okay, it's been a long time since the last class. Okay, please. Okay, we've been studying the Upāli Sutta. This is Sutta number 56 in the middle-length discourses. And this sutta features a debate between the Buddha and representatives of the Jains about the nature of karma. As I explained last time, the Jains were one of the main rival spiritual communities in India at the time of the Buddha. And their leader, their teacher, was a kind of personal rival of the Buddha. His name, the name that's given to him in the Buddhist texts, is Niganta Nataputta. The word Niganta is actually the name for all of the followers of the Jains. It means literally those who were without any bonds or any ties. And Nataputta was his personal name, actually the family name. But the Jains refer to him as the Jina. The word Jina means the conqueror. And so the word Jain or Jaina, by which we designate the followers of this religion, this word is derived from the title given to its chief teacher, the Jina, the conqueror. And so the Jainas are the followers of the Jina, the followers of the conqueror. And similarly, of course, the Buddha is called the Buddha, the enlightened one, the awakened one. And in ancient India, the followers of the Buddha were called the Bauddhas, those who take after or who follow the Buddha. Both Jainism and Buddhism accepted certain beliefs in common. They shared a belief in the idea of samsara, that all living beings are passing through a cycle of rebirths. They share the view that this cycle of rebirth is essentially suffering. And they share the view that the aim of the spiritual life is to break the bonds or ties that keep one bound to samsara, bound to the cycle of birth and death, and to gain liberation. They both refer to the state of liberation under the name Nibbana, Nirvana, or Vimukti. And they both call those who have achieved liberation arahats. They both refer to the forces that keep living beings in bondage by the word asava. This is the Pali word. The Sanskrit form is asrava, which means that which flows, probably that which flows in. Though the two schools understood the word asava in a somewhat different sense, but for both of them, the asavas were afflictive states, emotionally and cognitively afflictive states, which have to be overcome and eliminated to gain liberation. Both of them also believed that the force that determines human destiny as we go from life to life is our actions, what is called karma. And both of them emphasize the importance of renunciation, living a life of purity. Both place a lot of emphasis on not harming other living beings. The Jains emphasize this very strongly. For them, the key virtue is ahimsa, which means non-harming, non-injury. For Jainism, 4 of the key virtues are harmlessness, truthfulness, non-stealing, and celibacy. Okay, so what were some of the main differences between Buddhism and Jainism? One of the main differences in fundamental beliefs is that the Jains believe that every living being has a soul, that the core of the living being is a kind of entity within the person, which they call the jiva. The jiva means, literally, it's the living force of the person. And this living force is conceived of as an entity, like a soul, that migrates from life to life. In contrast, the key doctrine of the Buddha's teaching is anatta, non-self, the absence of any kind of permanent individual soul. And so for Jainism, liberation consists in the release of the soul from the chains of samsara, the chains of birth and death. Whereas for Buddhism, liberation is not the release of the soul, but ending the process of the ever-changing, impermanent process of conditioned phenomena that make up the individual being. The two also differ with regard to the conception of spiritual practice. Jainism teaches that we all have this store of, well, let's take, before I come to the spiritual practice, a difference in the conception of karma. This is quite an important point. The Jains conceive of karma as being a subtle type of material phenomena, a subtle kind of dust or dirt-like phenomena that gets deposited over the soul and obscures the brilliance, the boundless knowledge, the light of consciousness in the soul. And so according to the Jains, whenever we perform any kind of unwholesome action, this unwholesome action deposits particles of this subtle matter over the soul. And so it covers up the soul, the jiva, and it weighs down the soul, keeping it bound to the cycle of rebirths. Whereas for Buddhism, karma is not in any way a material force, but karma is conceived as, we can call it an ethical and psychological force. Karma for Buddhism means volitional action, and the chief factor responsible for volitional action is intention or volition. And what keeps karma, the cycle of karma, rolling for Buddhism are the mental defilements. And so this leads to a difference in their conception of spiritual practice. For Jainism, the task of spiritual practice is to eliminate the accumulations of old karma. We've all accumulated this mass of karma, these subtle material particles, through our actions in countless past lives. And so for Jainism, the task of the spiritual life is to clear away, to wipe away this accumulated layer of old karma. And one does this, according to Jainism, the way to do this is by undertaking ascetic practices. So Jainism emphasizes refraining from activity as much as possible and undertaking ascetic practices, fasting, inflicting pain on the body, sometimes standing in one position for long periods of time, undertaking these austere practices. And these austere practices have the function of wiping away the accumulated dust of old karma. Then, when one eliminates all of the old karma through the ascetic practices, then one gains liberation. And so the Jains refer to this method of practice. They use a word that comes down in Pali, nijara. Nijara means wearing out, wearing away. And so the Jains undertake these ascetic practices, these stern, difficult, demanding ascetic practices, in the belief that this is the way to wear out, to wear away their accumulations of old karma. The Buddha, when he engages in discussions with followers of the Jains, he also takes this word nijara, but he gives it a different meaning. Within his own system, nijara means wearing away, wearing out, not old karma, but wearing out greed, hatred, and delusion. In other words, eliminating the defilements. And so this shows us the difference in the Buddha spiritual path. Because karma is not considered, for Buddhism, it's not considered a material substance, but mental activity. Mental activity motivated by the defilements. So for Buddhism, the aim is to eliminate the defilements directly. And then this is to be done by the threefold training, the 3 stages of training in moral discipline, then mental purification or concentration, and then 3rd, insight or wisdom. Okay, now we can come back to our sutta, the Upāli Sutta, and just I'll have to recapitulate a little bit to see where we are. Okay, so in this sutta, the Buddha, it opens with the Buddha engaged in a discussion with one of the followers of the Jains, who's an ascetic named Diga Tapasi. The word means literally the tall ascetic. And at the very beginning, we find that there's a difference in terminology. They're having a discussion about the topic of karma. What is responsible for the performing of evil action, for the perpetuation of evil action? And the Buddha uses the word karma. He speaks of different kinds of action or karma, whereas the follower of the Jains says that we don't use the word action, but we use the word rod. As I mentioned last time, this strikes me a little bit strange because, I've read a bit on Jainism, and the books that I've read, the material that I've read, makes no mention of the concept of rod, but instead uses the word karma, also in relation to Jain philosophy. And so this part of the discussion is a little bit obscure. But anyway, according to the Jains, they speak of 3 kinds of rod for the performance of evil action. That is the bodily rod, the verbal rod, and the mental rod. And the 3 are different from each other. The Buddha speaks about 3 types of actions: bodily action, verbal action, and mental action. Okay, so this part of the discussion gets concluded Okay, then after they introduce this difference in terminology, they raise the question, which kind of rod or which kind of action has the greatest responsibility for the performance of evil action? And this is where the difference of point of view comes. According to the Jains, according to the Jain position, this is in paragraph 3, the worst kind of rod for the performance of evil action is the bodily rod. In other words, action performed through the body is held to be the worst. Whereas when the Buddha is questioned on this issue about the 3 kinds of action, he says the worst kind of action, the one most responsible for performing an evil action, here I'm on the top of page 479, the worst kind of evil action is the mental action, not so much bodily action and verbal action. Okay, so here we have a difference in point of view, where it seems that the Jains are laying emphasis on bodily action as being the most reprehensible, the most blameworthy type of action, whereas the Buddha is saying that mental action is the worst and the most blameworthy. And as I pointed out last time, again, this seems to me somewhat strange and a bit difficult to understand, because according to Buddhism, of course, for any karma to be performed, volition, mental intention is an essential element. And so without the presence of intention, no karma is created according to Buddhism. So if I'm walking down the street, trying my best to be mindful, and by accident I happen to step on some ants, I'm not creating any karma of killing, as long as I don't have the intention of killing the ants. So according to Buddhism, the presence of the mental factor of intention is essential for karma to be created. But this is the way I would see it. According to Buddhism, there are bodily actions, verbal actions, and purely mental actions. All 3 of them become karma because of the presence of intention or volition. But still, I would think on the basis of other suttas that probably bodily action, when it's motivated by an evil intention, would be more blameworthy than a purely mental action, which is not, or a purely mental deed, which is not expressed in bodily action. For example, if I have a thought of killing, I get so angry with somebody that I think I want to kill him, but it just remains a desire or a fantasy, but I don't do anything I don't act upon that thought. That would certainly be less blameworthy than if I go get a gun or a knife and kill the person. Doesn't that seem to be the case? So here it would seem that bodily action is worse than the mental action. Even if I don't kill the person, but if I get so angry that I lose my temper, lose any kind of self-restraint, and then start scolding the person, that would be worse than if I just controlled my anger and remained calm and restrained. Okay, so again, it seems that bodily action would be worse than This is, in my view, worse than purely mental action. So this passage, it's somewhat difficult to understand. The way I would interpret it, against the background of what I understand about the two schools, I think the original position would be that the Jains are saying that a bodily action still creates karma even when there's no volition or intention behind it. Whereas the Buddha is saying that the mental action is the most blameworthy because any action only creates karma when it's motivated and driven by a volition or an intention. Okay, so now, at the end of this discussion between the ascetic Upāli and the Buddha, Upāli joins the Jains. He goes to his master, Niganthanataputta, and then he reports his conversation with the Buddha. And then one of the lay disciples of the Jains, named Upāli, gets up from the crowd and says that I want to go debate with the Buddha, with the ascetic Gautama, about his doctrine. And he's very boastful. He says, when I meet the ascetic Gautama, I'm going to refute his doctrine. I'm just going to reduce him to shreds. I'm going to take him and when I get in a debate with him, I'm going to pull him this way, push him that way, spin him around, and make a fool out of him. I'll refute him, and I'm going to win him over to our doctrine. We'll convert him to Jainism. Okay, when Upāli makes this claim, the claim comes on page 480. Then the ascetic disciple, Digatapasi, protests to the master, Niganthanataputta. He says, I don't agree with Upāli's proposal that he go and debate with the Buddha, because the Buddha is a magician. He has a kind of magic by which he converts followers of other sects and wins them to his own doctrine. So Digatapasi says, therefore don't let him go debate with the Buddha, otherwise you're going to lose him. But their master Niganthanataputta says, don't worry, don't be concerned. That's impossible. It can't happen that the householder, the lay disciple Upāli, will become a disciple of Gautama. Rather, what will happen is that the ascetic Gautama will become a disciple of Upāli, and Upāli will win him over to our doctrine. Okay, so this discussion goes on a few times back and forth, and finally, the master Niganthanataputta gives Upāli permission. Go, argue with the Buddha, and you bring him over and we'll make him a good follower of our Jain teaching. Okay, so Upāli goes over, meets the Buddha. They repeat. When he meets the Buddha, they first go over the discussion, they review the discussion that the Buddha had earlier with Digatapasi. Then Upāli declares his purpose. He says, I want to debate with you. Here I'm in paragraph 10. I'm sorry. Upāli contradicts the Buddha and he upholds the position of the Jains. Then it's the Buddha who says, householder, if you will debate on the basis of truth, then we can have some discussion about this, some conversation about this. Then Upāli agrees to debate on the basis of truth. Okay, now the Buddha is going to use some examples to sort of contradict Upāli's position. And so in paragraph 11, he gives one example, which I went over last time, about the position of the Jains. Okay, I'll go over it again, because some people were not here that time. Okay, there is some Niganta, that's one of the ascetic, the monastic followers of the Jains. He might be very ill, and he might be refusing cold water. According to the Jain precepts, they don't drink cold water, they'll only drink hot water, because they believe in the cold water there are living beings, and so if they drink the cold water, they might be swallowing a living being and killing it. But they'll drink hot water. This is a little strange, because to prepare the hot water you have to boil it, and when you boil hot water, if there are living beings in it, they'll die anyway. Okay, so if he remains firm to his vows, he needs the cold water, but he refuses the cold water, where will he take rebirth according to the Jains? And then Upāli says he will take rebirth amongst a certain class of deities called Mano Satta, which means bound in mind. That's where he would be reborn. Why? Because when he died, he was bound in his mind by the attachment to the cold water. Okay, so now the Buddha points out, pay attention. Your reply puts you in a contradiction. You said earlier that the body action is more reprehensible than the mental action, but here it's the mental action of refraining from the cold water, that mental thought that leads one to rebirth amongst the gods. So that shows the power of the mental action. Okay, so the Buddha points out this contradiction in Upāli's position. Then Upāli says, even though the Blessed One has spoken thus, yet the bodily rod, he's still insisting on his position. He says, the bodily rod is still the most blameworthy for the performance of evil action. Not so much the verbal rod, not so much the mental rod. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to bring forward another argument. Paragraph 12. I think this I didn't cover. This is where I broke off last time, correct? Okay, so now the Buddha says, and he's referring to a doctrine of or a phrase that the Jains use to describe their training. The Jains, according to the Buddhist text, speak about 4 kinds of restraint practice that they practice. They say that they're restrained or curbed by all curbs, clamped by all curbs, cleansed by all curbs, and claimed by all curbs. It seems somewhat repetitive. Okay, but now the Buddha goes on and says, when they are walking forward, walking back, they still accidentally kill many small living beings. So what result does your teacher, Niganta Nataputta, describe for him? Then Upāli says, Niganta Nataputta does not describe an unintended action as being greatly reprehensible. In other words, when there's no intention, it's not really blameworthy. Then the Buddha asks, but if one intends it, what is the consequence? Then Upāli says, in that case, it's greatly reprehensible, very reprehensible, very heavy. Then the Buddha asks, under which of the three rods, the three types of action, does Nataputta describe the volition or the intention? Then Upāli says, under the mental rod. So the intention is a kind of mental action. So again, the Buddha points out a second time the contradiction in the position of Upāli. He's saying that the bodily deed is more blameworthy, but when there's no intention, then the deed, even though living beings are killed, but it's not blameworthy because there's no intention. And so Upāli is actually in agreement with the Buddha's position that it's intention which makes the deed an evil deed, or a case of unwholesome karma. Okay, but still Upāli is going to maintain his position again. It seems like he's being very obstinate and unyielding. And so he insists a third time that the bodily deed is the most reprehensible. Okay, so now the Buddha comes forward with a third counterexample. First, he refers to the town nearby which they are living, the town of Nalanda. It's very prosperous, populated, and crowded with people. Okay, so suppose a man came here with a sword and said, in one moment, in one instant, I am going to slay all the living beings in the town of Nalanda and turn them into just one heap of flesh. Would he be able to do that? Then Upāli says, even if there were 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50 men coming along with swords, they wouldn't be able to make, in one instant, they wouldn't be able to turn all the living beings in this town into one heap of flesh. So what could one single man do on his own? Seems like a somewhat strange counterexample, right? Okay, but now the Buddha says, suppose some ascetic or Brahmin came here who possesses supernormal power. This is the power of iddhi, some psychic power. And he's attained this mastery of his mind, which means the mastery over the psychic powers. And he said, I will reduce this town of Nalanda to ashes with one mental act of hatred. Would such an ascetic or Brahmin be able to do that? See, this was a belief in the period. It's maybe a little bit like you see who are these people who have this supernormal powers? Science fiction. Of course, I never watched these programs, but is it Star Wars where they have these kind of robots? What?
The Jedi. The Jedi.
Jedi.
J-E-D-I.
J-E-D-I. That's in Star Wars?
Star Wars.
They have they give off this laser beam which can destroy any object.
They have mental powers to move objects remotely.
Maybe not quite the same. Anyway, it was the Indian belief that there are these fierce ascetics, maybe like the present-day Shaivite ascetics. You know, they have the long matted locks. They put paint and coloring on their faces, and they undertake these difficult ascetic practices by which they build up the spiritual power. And so whenever one meets the ascetics like this, one has to treat them very politely, very respectfully, very cordially, because if one brushes up against them and annoys them or irritates them, then they become angry. And when they get angry, then they just let out a kind of mental act of hatred, which will just burn you up and reduce you to ashes. Okay, so this was a belief in the period. I mean, there might have been ascetics who really do exercise those practices. I think if you know the Indian film industry, in many of the popular Indian films, there's almost always, maybe the popular Indian films going back to ancient times, there's always this fierce ascetic who exercises these destructive psychic powers. Okay, so through a mere act of will, this ascetic could reduce the whole prosperous, populated town of Nalanda to ashes with just one thought. Okay, and then Upāli says that such an ascetic can reduce not only one Nalanda, but even 30, 40, or 50 cities like Nalanda. With one mental act, he could reduce them to ashes. Okay, so again, this shows how powerful the mind is compared to the body. Okay, still Upāli insists on his position, and so now the Buddha brings forth a fourth counter-example. He speaks about certain forests that were known in northern India during this period. I'm in paragraph 14. The Dandaka, the Kalinga, the Meja, and the Matanga forests. And he asks, do you know how these forests became forests? Originally, those areas supposedly they had been populated villages, towns, fields with crops growing. But then the kings of these kingdoms, of these states, had mistreated certain ascetics. And these ascetics became angry and upset. And then with their psychic powers, they reduced those states with their towns, villages, capital cities, their fields, reduce them all just to barren forests, to wasteland. Okay, so Upāli admits this at the bottom of page 483. And again, the Buddha points out the contradiction, that you've contradicted yourself. By your answer, you've shown that you yourself recognize that the mind is more powerful than the body. And yet you made the statement that you will debate on the basis of truth. Okay, so now, paragraph 15, Upāli throws away his old position, and now he explains what has been going on. He says, Bhante, Venerable, I was satisfied and pleased by you, the Blessed One, even by your very first simile. Nevertheless, I wanted to hear how you would solve these difficult problems. And so I kept on opposing you just to find out how you would argue, how you would answer. And now Upāli says, you have made this is actually all stock passage which comes here, which we find over and over in the suttas. You have made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though you were turning upright what had been turned upside down, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who is lost, or holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see forms. Now I go for refuge to the Blessed One, the Buddha, to the Dhamma, to the Sangha. Remember me as a lay follower who is gone for refuge for life. Okay, at this point, usually the Buddha would simply nod in silence, or he would give a little congratulatory sermon to the person who takes refuge. But now Upāli has been a very prominent man in the town of Nalanda. And he has many followers, and he has been himself a long-time devotee of the Jains. And so the Buddha doesn't just welcome him in, but he says, investigate thoroughly, householder. It is good for such well-known people like you to investigate thoroughly. Anuvicha karang ko gahapati karohi anuvicha karo tumhadi sanang nyatamanusanang sadhu hoti. Okay, so the Buddha says this, investigate thoroughly, examine my teaching. Don't just come over out of emotional enthusiasm, but make sure that you can confirm the teaching for yourself. Okay, when the Buddha says this, then Upāli says, now I'm even more satisfied with the Buddha for speaking like that. If the leaders of the other sects were to gain me as a disciple, then they would carry a banner all over Nalanda announcing this chief householder Upāli has become our disciple. But instead, the Buddha, the Blessed One, is telling me to investigate thoroughly. So for this reason, a second time I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Okay, and now the Buddha, again, he doesn't immediately welcome Upāli, but he tells Upāli, your family, your household, for a long time has supported the Nikantas, the Jain monks and nuns. And so you should consider giving alms to them whenever they come to you. So the Buddha isn't saying, just give alms to me and my followers, but he's urging Upāli, continue to support the Jains. They are dependent on you, so give alms to them. And when the Buddha says this, then Upāli is pleased even more. And he says that I've heard others saying that the ascetic Gautama says, gifts should be given only to me and not to the other teachers. Gifts should be given only to my disciples, but not to the disciples of the other teachers. Only what is given to me is fruitful, not what is given to others, and so on. But now Upāli says, you are encouraging me to give gifts to the Jains. I will know the time for that. And then a third time, I go for refuge to the Buddha, to the Dhamma, to the Sangha. Okay, maybe I'll ask if anybody has any questions at this point. Okay, then we'll go on. Okay, now after Upāli has declared 3 times that he goes for refuge to the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, now the Buddha gives him what is called a progressive instruction. By progressive doesn't mean that he's urging him to to request single-payer health care, or to protest the war, or to endorse a reasonable ecological policies. but it means a step-by-step or graduated instruction in the Dhamma, going from simpler teachings to deeper and more difficult teachings, more profound teachings. And so the Buddha begins with talk about giving, the practice of dana or generosity. Then he gives a talk on sila, on virtue or observing the precepts. Then he gives a talk about the heavens, explaining how the practice of generosity, the practice of virtue, harmlessness, goodness, compassion, honesty, truthfulness, and so on, how those actions will create wholesome karma that will lead to rebirth in the heavenly realms. Then the Buddha goes on to explain the danger or drawback, the degradation and defilement in sensual pleasures and the blessings or the advantages of renunciation. And then as the Buddha is explaining these matters, Upāli's mind he's listening intently, listening with keen attention, absorbing the teaching. As he's absorbing the teaching, his mind is settling down. His mind is becoming composed. It's becoming prepared, receptive, free from hindrances, elated or uplifted, and trusting and confident. Okay, so now the Buddha has ripened Upāli's mind with this step-by-step instruction. And it's when the Buddha knows that Upāli's mind has become composed, settled, uplifted, and trusting. And then one of these expressions is free from hindrances. He's no longer opposing the teaching in any way, but he's completely opened himself up to the teaching. And now the Buddha expounds what is called the Buddhanang Samukhangsika Dhammadesana, which means, here it's translated, the teaching special to the Buddhas, suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path. These are the four noble truths. And notice the methodology behind the Buddha's teaching. Usually when we want to get a basic book on Buddhism, like what the Buddha taught, or the Buddha's ancient path, or any kind of introduction to Buddhism, you open up to page 1, or maybe after the first introduction, when you come to chapter 1, the first section will be the Four Noble Truths, as though that is the most elementary, most basic teaching of Buddhism. But this is somewhat misleading. The Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths in his first sermon, his first discourse, because he was teaching the 5 ascetics who had left the household life years earlier and who had been practicing austerities in the forest for many years, who had been practicing different types of meditation, and their minds were already disposed to understand the deep teaching of the Dhamma. And so when the Buddha met his first disciples, the 5 ascetics, then he could teach them the Four Noble Truths, because they already had a strong spirit of renunciation. They already had very strong, wholesome roots. They had already had firm determination to realize the truth. They probably had of course they would have had strong self-discipline. They would have probably had very powerful minds through the practice of meditation. And just what they were lacking was just the light of wisdom that could open their minds so they could attain realization. They needed just a few words from the Buddha to open their minds and understand the Four Noble Truths. But when the Buddha is teaching somebody who is not yet well prepared, then he has to ripen that person, bring that person to maturity. And so the Buddha brings a person to maturity through this graduated discourse on the Dhamma. It's called Anupubika Katta. Anupubikatta. Anupubika means literally taking each thing in order, taking each item in proper order, in sequential order. Well, sequence and order mean the same. Taking each thing in proper sequence. And so, in order to win somebody over, one begins with something which is quite basic and elementary, which ordinary people could respond to and say resonate with, and that is the benefits or the loftiness of giving, the practice of generosity. Like all good religious teachings in the world, in one way or another, praise generosity. And so when one hears the Buddha speak about generosity, then one can recognize that this is a wholesome teaching. Then the Buddha will bring in sila. The first generosity, this is dana, giving. Then sila, the Buddha will speak about the 5 precepts, abstaining from killing, abstaining from stealing, abstaining from sexual misconduct, abstaining from false speech, abstaining from intoxicants. And so then when one hears about the 5 precepts, one realizes that the Buddha is teaching a doctrine that inculcates a correct way of life, a way of life based on harmlessness, compassion, honesty, self-restraint, truthfulness, sobriety. Then, when the Buddha speaks about the heavens, maybe people are skeptical about this today, but in ancient India, this was a very basic belief. And so when the Buddha would speak about how undertaking these wholesome practices will lead to a rebirth in heaven, then people will accept that he indeed teaches the doctrine of karma. And he can show us the way to a rebirth in heaven. But then, when the Buddha speaks about generosity, virtue, and the heavens, if the person just remains satisfied with that, the Buddha might not go any further. But if the Buddha sees that the person has the capacity to understand things which are still deeper, then he'll explain what is called here the danger, degradation, and defilement in sensual pleasures. He'll explain how the pursuit of sensual pleasures so it seems to promise happiness, but it leads to frustration, futility, misery. It brings people into conflict. It just locks one into this ever-recurring cycle of craving, pursuit, gratification. Then more craving, more wanting, more pursuit. And then he'll show that the way to liberation lies in the direction of reducing one's craving for sensual pleasures, eventually taking that step in the direction of renunciation, abandoning the pursuit of sensual pleasures. Okay, then when the listener's mind, if it vibrates in accordance with the spirit of renunciation, then the Buddha will realize that this person is able to understand the Four Noble Truths. And so the Buddha then, using his own power of mind, he assesses the state of mind of the listener, and he'll know this person is ready. The mind is, a better word is actually kalang, kalachitang. A better translation would be a pliant mind, a malleable mind. Actually, the first one is the pliant mind. The next one, mudducitta, is a malleable mind, a soft mind, a gentle mind. Then vinivaranacita, a mind which is rid of hindrances. Probably this is referring to the 5 hindrances: sense desire, ill will, dullness, restlessness, and doubt. So when these 5, as the listener is listening and placing trust in the Buddha, then these 5 hindrances subside. And when the 5 hindrances subside, then the mind becomes uddagga-citta. The mind rises up, it becomes elated, it's expanding, opening up, and then it becomes pasanna-citta. This is a calm mind, a tranquil mind, also a trusting mind. Okay, so then the Buddha can expound the Four Noble Truths: suffering, origin, cessation, and the path. Okay, and then the text uses a simile here to explain what is going to take place next. Just as a clean cloth with all marks removed would take the dye evenly. Okay, this is the quality of this mind now. The mind which has become ready, receptive, free from hindrances, elated and confident. It's like the clean cloth with all marks, with all stains removed. It takes the dye evenly. So Upāli's mind was able to absorb the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And as his mind absorbed that teaching, there arose in him, while he was sitting there, what is called the Virajang Vitamalang Dhammachakung. Virajang means spotless, without any dust. Vitamalang, without any stain, immaculate. Dhammachaku, the eye of Dhamma, the vision of the Dhamma. So Upāli, sitting there, listening to the Buddha's teaching, was able to gain what is called the Dhammachaku. This is the inner eye of wisdom, which sees into the truth of the Dhamma, into the truth of the teaching. And this means that he penetrated with wisdom, with direct wisdom, the Four Noble Truths. And as he did that, he eradicated the 3 fetters and became the 3 lower fetters and became a stream enterer, a sotapanna. So he gained the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dhamma, which the text expresses by the phrase, all that is subject to arising is subject to cessation. And so The householder Upāli saw the Dhamma, he attained the Dhamma, understood the Dhamma, fathomed the Dhamma, he crossed beyond doubt. He had now abandoned doubt completely, did away with perplexity. He gained intrepidity, a rather bookish word. He gained, let us say, full confidence in the teaching, self-confidence, and he became independent of others in the Buddha's dispensation, in the Buddha's teaching. That means he now had the wisdom which realizes the essential truth of the teaching. So he doesn't depend, at this point, he doesn't have to depend on anybody else, not even the Buddha himself. He's now independent of others. That insight into the truth of the teaching, the truth of the Dhamma, has now become integrated into his own being, his own mind. So he possesses the right view of the Noble Eightfold Path, and all the other factors of the path have arisen in him. So all he has to do now is to continue to cultivate the path, and he will reach liberation. He's now, it's incapable of ever turning away from the Dhamma, but he'll just go on, whether in this life or in future lives, but at most 7 more lives, till he gains full liberation. Okay, we'll pause at this point, and then I'll ask whether there are any questions. No questions today. Oh, yeah, please.
When he was, when the Buddha was explaining, after talk on virtue, talk on the heavens,
Yeah.
would the discussion of merit been at that point?
Yeah, I think we can be sure that that would have been a discussion about the merits. How the merit of giving, the merit of observing precepts or virtue, how this merit conduces to rebirth in the heavens.
So this progression, is there any timelines associated with it? Because, I mean, did he do this all in one day or 1 week or?
Oh, no, this would be in one sitting.
One sitting?
Yeah,
Okay.
oh yeah. No, the Buddha is just presenting this step-by-step discourse all in one session.
Okay, so the student was very precocious.
Yeah, he was a precocious student, yeah.
But the follow-up for the average person, what is this developmental course? What would we be looking at?
I'm
A
not quite...
lifetime, a month, many hundreds of lifetimes?
Once he gets the eye of Dhamma?
Well, this preparatory sequence you have.
Oh, that depends so much on different individuals. There's no fixed rule that fits all individuals. And then the Buddha sometimes, if he's teaching some people, and they don't have the capacity to grasp the Four Noble Truths, say, the Buddha won't go on to the Four Noble Truths. If they don't have the capacity to grasp what's called the danger, degradation, defilement, and sensual pleasures, he might not even go on to that. But he'll just speak about avoiding evil actions, performing wholesome actions, and leave it at that. And then maybe the person has to mature over time.
So then one more follow-up. The strategy of presenting the Four Noble Truths so prominently in the teaching
Yeah.
in modern times, what does that result in?
Well, I think in a way it's necessary when people want to to know what is distinctive about Buddhism. if, say, we as monks, sometimes we get invited to come to a college or to a school or to a church from another religion and say, please tell us about Buddhism. If we just give a lecture about practicing generosity and observing precepts, then turn around and walk out, the students will think, well, we've been reading our textbook. They speak about Four Noble Truths, dependent origination, 3 characteristics. And this monk just speaks about generosity and precepts. Let's follow him. But maybe it dilutes the impact of those teachings. I don't know. Yep.
So 2 questions. So then, this seems to be a pretty standard approach that the Buddha would use in talking about the Dhamma?
Yeah. It's actually, all of this is pretty much a stock passage which we find again and again. It occurs in a few suttas in the Digha Nikaya, a few suttas in Majjhima Nikaya. Throughout the Nikayas, that formula occurs. And it's a way of indicating how a disciple will achieve what's meant by the arising of the Dhamma eye, the vision of Dhamma. It usually indicates the attainment of the first of the 4 stages of realization, that is the stage of stream entry. So once one gains the Dhamma eye, it doesn't mean that one has come to the end of the path, but it means one has become established on the path, so that one is irreversible. One can never turn away from the path, whether in this life or in future lives.
And I also can't help but notice there's no discussion, as there is in the West, of a meditation practice.
Yeah.
We say that begins with meditation.
Yeah, which, this doesn't mean that one shouldn't think that the meditation practice is not important, but it's just that in cases like this, what I would say is that the Buddha knows that this is a person, because the Buddha can read the mind of this person, not only what they're thinking now, but he can see the past, we call this the past, the propensities of the person, their past accumulations of wholesome roots, good roots. And so the Buddha will know that this person has the capacity to gain some stage of realization. Then I think as the Buddha speaks, my supposition, through the power of his personality, he's actually putting that person into a kind of meditative state, so that the person's mind is settling down and becoming, it's not going into a samadhi, otherwise he wouldn't be able to hear the Buddha's voice, but the mind has become very calm, settled, receptive and open. And that is really, in a way, the aim of meditation practice, is to put the mind into that state. But for a person who doesn't have the capacity to gain realization by listening to the Buddha's discourse, such a person would have to undergo a more systematic type of training in which meditation would come in.
And are there other passages where the Buddha recommends that?
Well, in so many passages where the Buddha is giving advice to those in training, then he'll explain, the system of meditation. Any further question?
So this ability to respond to this, I don't know quite what you call it, transmission of consciousness is person-specific.
Yeah. A person's capacity to respond to the Buddha's teaching in this way, I'd say generally is person-specific. Though sometimes we read in the text that the Buddha is giving a discourse to a group of people, might be 5, 10 people, and all of them gain this vision of the Dhamma while they're listening to the Buddha's discourse.
In Siddha Yoga, it's called Shakti.
It's a kind of Shakti, yeah. Except that it's not the way I have heard the Shakti explained in some of the yogas. It's like the guru teaches, touches the disciple on the head, and then a kind of, almost like an electric current goes through them, or some current of spiritual power. But the Buddha's method is not like that. There's no transmission of a physical type of force, or even a spiritual type of force. But I would just think that the Buddha's spiritual power puts the person into this receptive frame of mind. But the Buddha's method always focuses on understanding. One has to understand the truth. And so that is why the Buddha expounds the Dhamma. And then he depends upon the student who is listening to grasp the principles of the teaching through the act of listening, reflection, and then penetration with insight.
It's amazing it's such a cognitive process.
It is a very cognitive process, yeah. Okay, I think we'll have to end for the evening. Okay, so we end with the sharing of the merits. We share the merits with the devas, that's the deities, the nagas, the dragon spirits, the bhutas, the fear spirits, asking them to rejoice and to protect the Dhamma, protect the world, protect ourselves. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang ditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya.